This morning, for a second week in a row, we find ourselves in the temple with our Lord as he addresses this second parable to the chief priests and the scribes. And like the parable last week, this one convicts them. And Jesus wants them to understand these parables because it is not merciful to pretend that everything's okay. Rather, it is merciful to speak the truth. And that's exactly what our Lord is doing with the Pharisees. In the second parable, unlike last weekend, Jesus doesn't have to explicitly explain the parable to them, something he usually doesn't do, but he doesn't want this to slip by them. But rather, he places it within the context of an allegory in the book of Isaiah that pretty much reveals what the parable is all about to them. And that is our first reading for today, Isaiah chapter 5, verse 1 to 7. It is the Lord's vineyard parable or allegory in the prophet Isaiah. And Isaiah's allegory here it's a love story. I have a friend. Of course, the prophet's friend is the Lord. And the Lord has a vineyard. And the story makes explicit that the Lord's vineyard is the house of Israel, as we also found ourselves singing in the psalm today. The vineyard is Isaiah, and it's a love story. God gives his beloved everything they need. He bestows his gifts upon her. And she, in return, the house of Israel, produces wild grapes, sour grapes. And so what is the Lord to do? He asks. He's going to tear down the walls. He's no longer going to till the land. He's not going to let the rain fall upon it. It will become a wasteland. It will be no more. Now, what the prophet Isaiah is doing, he is in the exact same place as our Lord is in today's gospel passage. He came to Jerusalem, to the temple, to speak to the chief priests and elders a word of warning from the Lord. The Lord loves you. Turn from your ways, or all that you see will be destroyed, because sin leads to death. Period. That is the words Lord through the prophet Isaiah. Now place yourself in the position of the chief priests and elders in Jesus' day. He's come into the temple. He's addressing these parables to them. And they're not going to be happy. This is going to lead to the trial. These words of the Lord, and it happens just before his passion. And Jesus takes that allegory from the prophet Isaiah and changes it a little bit to embrace salvation history. It is still about a bride and her groom. It is a love story that God gives his people everything they need. He plants a vineyard, puts a wall around it. He protects them, puts a watchtower there so they won't go astray. And it is a rich and fertile land. And when it's time to receive his produce, he sends his servants, the prophets. And one they beat up, another they kill, and a third they stone. Now those listening to this story would have been thinking about the prophets in their history, in their ancestry. They would think of the prophet Isaiah himself, who gave us the allegory of the Lord's vineyard. Isaiah spoke that same word of warning to the chief priests and elders, a word of judgment unless the people change their ways. And what did they do to the prophet Isaiah? Tradition holds that the wicked king Manasseh cut Isaiah in two. They killed him. What about the one they stoned? They would have thought of Jeremiah, who also, while Isaiah spoke 800 years before Christ, Jeremiah spoke 600 years, 500 years between those before Christ. And Jeremiah also went to the temple to speak to the chief priests and elders and to warn them about the destruction of Jerusalem unless they changed their hearts. And what did they do to Jeremiah? Well, they didn't like his message. They put him down in a cistern. They tried to kill him a number of times. Tradition holds that Jeremiah ended up being stoned to death in Egypt. Jesus is talking about these major prophets. But that didn't stop the Lord. He continued to send his servants to them, and he sent more than before. And what did they do to them? They did the same thing. That is the past. And then Jesus' parable moves to the future. So the Father sends the Son. And what do they do to the Son? They drag him outside of the vineyard, outside the walls of the vineyard, and they kill him. Jesus is prophesying his passion and his death. Because make no mistake about it, this vineyard is an allegory for Jerusalem and Israel. And just as the vineyard had a wall around it and a watchtower, so did Jerusalem have a wall around it and a watchtower. And just as they dragged the Son out of the vineyard and killed him, so they dragged the Lord outside the walls of the ancient city of Jerusalem. St. John makes abundantly clear in the Gospel of John that Golgotha was outside of the old city's walls in chapter 19. And so Jesus is speaking a word of love and warning, trying to shake them, awaken them to what's going to happen. So what's going to happen to the tenants? Well, they're going to meet a wicked, a wretched end, they say to the Lord. What about the vineyard? Well, he's going to give it to other people. It's not quite right. It's not quite right. So Jesus follows the parable to correct this mistake. And he quotes from the Psalm 118, which is our opening hymn today. We know it more for this is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice in it and be glad. But it's connected to the parable, the last verse. The stone which the builders has rejected has become the cornerstone. Has become the cornerstone. Everyone would have known this psalm. This was a psalm that was sung every Passover. Everyone, from child to the elderly, knew this psalm inside out. They knew all the verses. They sang it with joy because it was a messianic psalm. It was believed by the rabbis of Jesus' day that when the Messiah would come, he would build a new temple. And so what's going to happen in the vineyard? It's going to be destroyed. And Jesus is going to establish a new temple where people serve the Lord in spirit and in truth. The old order passes away. The two major institutions that go back to Moses, the tabernacle, which becomes the temple, and the Sanhedrin, the unifying, the guiding body of leadership in Israel, ends as Jesus predicted it would end. The Sanhedrin is no more. There is no longer a temple on the Temple Mount. Rather, there's the dome of the rock and a mosque. The old order has passed away. This is a prophetic moment for our Lord, speaking to the leaders of the people that all they hold dear is passing away. But what does this parable have to do with us today? Well, the church recognized this passage as significant in understanding the church. It is called upon, it is quoted in the Vatican II document of the Constitution of the Church, or Lumen Gentium. In speaking about the nature of the church, it gives this parable. And it speaks about the church as being the new vineyard of God, in which he plants the vine, our Lord Jesus Christ. And we as the church are branches on that vine in this vineyard. It speaks of the missionary work that apart from him, like we talked about last weekend, without being in communion with him, we can do nothing. And so it is an image of the church in the world today, the new vineyard of God. But as we reflect on this parable, we also have to note the twist in the story. And this makes it very pertinent for us today. The twist in the parable that we could very easily miss because we know this parable so well. But think back over this story, how Jesus is telling it. Imagine you're hearing it for the first time. The landowner gives his vineyard over to tenant workers. When it's time to receive its produce, he sends his servants. And what do? They beat him up. They kill him and they stone him. He sends more servants. And what do these more servants? They do the exact same thing. They kill him. They beat him up. They stone him. So the homeowner thinks to himself, you know what? The next logical step for me is to send my son. And we would say, what? That's where they started scratching their heads and saying, that makes no sense. Why would you send your son when they've killed all those you sent before? The thought going through their minds would have been, this father is crazy. What is he doing to his son? Because what many people in the world around us think, and a thought that can even enter our minds if we're not careful, is this: people don't change. People can't change. This is not the voice of God. This is the voice of the advocate. The accuser says that we can't change. That once a sinner, always a sinner. You see, the Father and the Son in Jesus' parable is no ordinary father nor ordinary son. But rather, it is the God of infinite mercy that even after sending his beloved prophets to his bride, even after they mistreated them, he still sends his son because God believes that we are capable of changing. God longs for the sinner to turn his heart back to him. This is the good news of the gospel for us today. That we should never give up on our enemies, never give up on the enemies of the Lord, but rather we should be willing to lay down our lives to bring them closer to him. Which seems crazy to the world around us. But we see this in the life of Christ. What is the base sin of the tenants in the vineyard today? Greed. Greed. They wanted that which wasn't theirs. They wanted to possess that which they had no right to. They wanted to take from God what was God's. And when they saw the Son, they saw the heir to everything they thought they possessed. It is the sin of greed that allowed them to steal from God. They were thieves, taking from God what belonged to God. And so, who is Jesus crucified between? Two thieves. Two thieves who acknowledged they were guilty, even though they knew the Lord was innocent. Can a person change? Christ believes so. Even on the cross, their last breaths, one of those thieves allowed his heart to be softened and repented his sins. And on his death bed, the cross, he received salvation. As the Lord said to him, today, you will be with me in paradise. This is the heart of God. To do what seems crazy in the eyes of the world. To love the sinner so much that they would speak the truth and lay down their life for us. And so as we celebrate this Eucharist, may we be conformed to that mercy. May we live this parable. May we be forgiving as God is so forgiving of us.